1 John chapter 2. It's good to see so many people out today. I hope that we can continue to have more people join with us as some of the restrictions are lessened. I know that it may be quite some time for some people, understandably so. Keep on going back and forth in my mind, not being in a high-risk category, it's hard for me to really assess how other people ought to feel, so I'm just going to leave that completely to them to let them feel how they think they ought to feel in regards to their safety. We're going to be looking here in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 and following in just a moment. I know that most of us are transplants to some degree. Not many of us were born here in Virginia. Whether it be in Alaska or from Canada or wherever you were born at. I know that a lot of us have moved in from other areas to be here, and rightfully so. We tend to kind of have a two-home status. The home where we grew up in, back home in Canada or Alaska or in the army, military, whatever form of military that was, and then currently where we are now. And it kind of leaves us in a slightly different position. There are some places that you move into, and if you're not from there, you will never be from there. But there are other places that are typically transitory, and you can kind of fit in wherever. As Christians, we also have that same dilemma, where we are from here, but we're not of here. And John speaks to that here in chapter 2 of 1 John. He says in verse 15, "Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eye, and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. The world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." Sometimes I really enjoy John's writings. Sometimes he's a bit challenging because he doesn't equivocate. And I really like when people equivocate, where they give me outs. If I don't want to do exactly what they say, they can give me little loopholes. I enjoy that. John, he buttons all the loopholes up pretty tightly. He doesn't give you any, don't love the world as if it gives you problems. It's just, don't love the world or the things of the world. And there's a lot to love in this world. I learned really recently that I love the Grand Tetons. That's pretty amazing. Yellowstone is pretty nice. I'm assuming Glacier is nice too, but Lee just wouldn't let us go. That's a whole nother story altogether. There is a lot though to love. Whether it's you love where you're from, or all the places you've traveled, or even the country that you're currently a part of. There is a lot of wonderful things about the United States. And if you ever get to travel to other countries, you realize that coming back home, that's pretty nice coming back home. Some of the freedoms and liberties and the prosperity, there's so much to like about here. The problem is sometimes we who are of two homes tend to fall in love with the wrong one. And that this one is really so nice, and that sometimes we forget that this isn't the one that we're supposed to be drastically in love with. And he gives us reasons here in verse 16. Well, he gives us reasons starting in verse 15. The first one he mentions that if you have the love of the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Again, non-equivocating. This isn't he may not, or may not. This is a straightforward, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Again, I like when people equivocate, but John just doesn't for us here. It is an if. If this happens, then this doesn't happen. Then he gives more reasons in verse 16. He says, all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eye, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. All the love of the world leads us to sin. That's kind of his point here. That if you find that you're struggling in an area of sin, that is going to fall back to one of these three categories in verse 16. It's either the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eye, or the pride of life. one of these three things is going to be one of your core reasons that you're going to be leading yourself further and further into sin. Consider what Paul writes to Timothy. I know that the wind, this has been interesting the last few weeks, try to keep Bibles open for those who are old-fashioned. But 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. He mentions Demas. This is Paul, while in prison in Rome, writing to Timothy about kind of last-minute arrangements. And he writes here in verse 9, he begs him, do your best to come to me soon, for Demas, in love of this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Demas has been mentioned other times in Paul's writing as being a faithful follower, someone who's been a great help to Paul. Here is someone who's left home and family, has been traveling with Paul for some time. He knows the gospel inside and out, as you would say, and yet, for the love of this world, he's forsaken Paul. And I believe the indication is, given what we read over in Matthew 13, that he just didn't abandon Paul, is that he just, for the love of this world, he abandoned the faith. In fact, that is the wording we have in Matthew 13:22, when it comes to the parable of the sower. The second half of chapter 13, he gives the explanation of what the parable means. And in verse 22, he mentions those who were sown, or the seed that was sown among the thorns. There in verse 22, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of sin choke out the word, and it ultimately proves unfruitful. This is a major issue. James, if you're kind of back towards the end of your New Testament, in chapter 4 and in verse 4, James and John have this very unequivocating way of writing. They're just going to tell you exactly how it is. And in verse 4, he's just straight up says, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Again, no loopholes, no maybes. This is exactly as it is. Realizing that the thing that we cling to so closely, that the home that we love so much, is leading us further and further down the path of sin. I don't know how far, how much the word sprung up in Demas before the cares of this world choked him out, but it did. I don't know how many times, what kind of issues they were having here in James's time. He mentions in James chapter 1 that he writes to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. This would probably be around Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 9, whenever the Jews who became Christians were under persecution, and they took the gospel and they began to spread it out throughout Judea and Samaria. And these were people who are suffering for their faith. They're being spread out and they're teaching other people, and yet here they're still struggling with the love of this world. And James just simply states that if you have friendship with this world, you have enmity between you and God. That you cannot have one and the other. Now, if you go back to where we were in 1 John chapter 2, he gives us a third reason. So verse 15 is, if you love the world, the love of the Father is not in you. In verse 16, he kind of gives you an itemized list of how loving the world leads you into sin. And then in verse 17, he gives you the other answer, or the third answer, is that the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. Ultimately, this world is not going to last very long, nor are the things of this world. If you go over to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, Solomon wrestles with this in his writings in Ecclesiastes. A lot of people rage against the dying of the light, if you guys like poetry. And they try to somehow make themselves have an indelible mark on history. Monuments and statues and putting names on libraries and conquering great swaths of land in order to be known. And there are a lot of people who their name is written on history, or have their face carved into stone, whatever it happens to be. But Solomon wrestles with this as you look at Ecclesiastes of how much really lasts afterwards. Even of people who have stamped their name indelibly on history, how much you really know about them. What is their personality like? What kind of humor did they have? What's their favorite types of foods? What was their favorite thing to do on a Friday night? Those things are usually completely lost. And Solomon, after the beginning of chapter 2, where he says he's applied his heart and his wisdom to seek and to find out pleasure, the rest of chapter 2 is doom and despair. Because here in verse 18, he says, I hated the toil, all my toil in which I toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to a man who is to come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool? Yet he will be the master of all which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned my heart over and gave it up to despair for all my toil and my labor under the sun. Because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone else who did not toil for it. And this also is vanity. Okay, so imagine you have as much money as you need for the rest of your life, and your kids' life, and your grandkids, and your great-grandkids. And there have been people in the United States who have so much money that their great-great-great-grandkids still don't have to work. If that was the case for you, once you're dead and gone, what does that equal up to? Solomon, if anybody really had the money to make this point, Solomon seems to be the person who make this point, where he would have been so wealthy that he could have, that silver became like stones in Israel at this time. That gold became so plentiful that it was as if it was silver. There hasn't been prosperity like that since this point in time. And Solomon, after seeing all the money that he has amassed, says, I hate it at all, because I don't get to do anything with it. There's a certain point in time that you can go from really cheap steak to like really nice steak. But after a certain point, like, you don't make steak any better. You can only enjoy so much out of life. And then after that, well, okay, then what? And if you back up to verse 16, he mentions here, he says, for the wise, as the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that his days to come all will be long forgotten. How the wise dies, just like the fool. Whether it be possessions or whether it get to be your lasting remembrance, ultimately, all that's here is going to be gone. We work and we work, we amass and we amass and we gather, and then whenever we can't fit all the stuff we want to put into where the spaces are, we gather it all up and give it to Salvation Army, and then we amass and collect more and more. To what end and what extent and what purpose? But let's say, turn over to 2 Peter chapter 3. Let's say that Lee gets to put his name indelibly on history and has all the money that he wants to for just Josh. We'll leave Jake out of it. All the money for Josh and his grandkids to enjoy for the rest of their lives. Peter makes the point here in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 through 13. He says, the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, and the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and its works that are done in it will be exposed. If Lee does the impossible, that only a few people have done, and puts his name on history and has all the money that him and his kids and grandkids and great-grandkids will ever want, even that's not going to last forever. There's going to be a point in time where everything will be burned. The greatest buildings that have ever been built, the greatest songs that have ever been written, the most beautiful XYZ that you can imagine are all going to be dissolved. So Peter then asks the question in verse 11, since all these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be? Which is kind of the whole point of what we're getting at. We're starting back in 1 John chapter 2, not to love the world or the things of this world, because of those the three reasons he gives. And Peter follows up with, what kind of people ought you to be if that's the case? If the love of the world is not supposed to be in you, or the love of the things of the world, because they're going to be dissolved, because if you love the world, then the love of the Father is not in you. If the love of the world leads to sin, what kind of people ought you to be? And then he gives the answer in verses 11 and 12. In lives of holiness and godliness, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of the God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire, dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will be melted and burned. But according to his promise, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth, in which righteousness dwells. Therefore, beloved, since you are waiting for these things, be diligent to be found by him without spot or blemish, and be at peace. Consider Hebrew. Look at the wording here in chapter 3 of 2 Peter, and turn a couple pages back to Hebrews chapter 11, or a couple scrolls back, however that works on e-formats. He tells us that we should be a people who are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 and following, he talks about Abraham. For by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to a city that had foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and acknowledged them from afar, and acknowledging that they were strangers and exiles on this earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. Peter says that we're to be people who are living lives of holiness and godliness, that we are waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, and we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And the Hebrew writer says that that's exactly how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were, that they lived their life in a way that made it clear that they were not thinking of the land in which they left. They made it clear that they were looking for a better country, a heavenly country. And therefore, God wasn't ashamed to be called their God. So I just have a couple quick questions for you to ponder. If that's how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob dwelt, and they received their commendation from God because of that, do you live in such a way to show that you do not love this world or the things of this world? The Hebrew writer says that they made it clear by their actions that they didn't love the world or the things of this world. The question is, for you in your life, can you look at your life and say, well, it's clear that that's the same thing for me? How much stress, worry, and fear and anxiety could you save yourself by giving up the love of this world? And again, I have no idea what the answers are for you in your life, but how many people worry and stress over finances and houses and clothes and food? Whenever you get to the very beginning of the gospel in Matthew chapter 6, and Jesus says, don't be anxious about food or houses or clothing. Seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. And yet, through the love of this world, we spend a lot of time worried about this world, and usually the excess of this world. And finally, just the last question, have you fallen in love with the wrong home? There's a lot to love about this home. But this isn't the end. I mean, this isn't the end all be all. There's a lot more than just this home. It was ironic that I was preparing for this, and one of my friends on Facebook had posted just a random post, no way connected, is that this world is not my home, and it's not even my rental space. It works out. And we are called to be exiles and sojourners. We are called to be foreigners in a strange land. And I think sometimes I feel too comfortable being exactly where I am and not quite enough of a foreigner. So those are hopefully good questions for you to ponder. I hope that you take some time this week and to really consider it and ask yourself, when it comes to my two homes, which one do I truly love more? Because you can't serve two masters. You can either love the one, hate the other, be devoted to one or despise the other, but you cannot love the world and love God. Those two things do not go together. At this time, we'll have our invitation song, number 504, and then we'll ask Josh, if he will, to close us in prayer.